All right, so we have a very special guest today for our town hall. We
Yep.
have Maks Kraidelman, and Max is an environmental engineer and senior sustainable aviation consultant at ICF Engineering based in London.
So in addition to opening a branch in the UK, we're going to continue to expand our network there. And Max, I'm glad that you can join us for the town hall. For those of you who are zooming in, there might be a little bit of a lag as we connect across the pond.
Thank you so much for that flattering introduction, and it's a pleasure to be able to share some of my knowledge today on Earth Day. It's a special treat. And yeah, so for me, growing up, I've always been interested in aviation and sustainability. And throughout my education and my early career, they seem to be quite contradictory interests. But, the way that the regulatory environment's developing, the way that travelers and passenger trends and priorities have begun to change. I would say ever since the Paris Agreement in 2015, there's been this, explosion of interest and need for sustainable minded action and interventions within aviation. So that's kind of presented me with that opportunity and that space to work in an industry that I love, work in an industry that is so critical to economic connectivity, to cultural exchange, while making that a positive impact and trying to make the industry one that is around for years to come.
Max, can you give us a little bit of an explanation about the magnitude of the carbon emissions issue in aviation?
Yeah, happy to. So if we look at 2019, pre-pandemic levels, the peak of aviation, peak of global aviation, total emissions were around 900 million tons of carbon dioxide, which may seem like a really large number, but that equated to roughly 2.5% of global emissions,
Wow.
roughly a third of transport-related emissions. So, with all of this scrutiny and, evaluation under a microscope, you would expect that percent share of global emissions to be significantly larger. But what differs aviation from other transport sectors, from other global sectors, is that the pathway to decarbonization is increasingly difficult and more complex than, let's say, the automotive industry or heavy manufacturing. The opportunities for electrification or for the integration into the hydrogen economy are much more difficult when it comes to aviation. So what you have is an industry that is continuing to grow. IATA forecasts 4.5% continual growth out until 2050. So while other industries are able to more readily and easily and more affordably decarbonize, you have aviation that's growing at a quite rapid rate, which has significant hurdles that need to be overcome. So that's why you're getting a lot of this attention on the industry today.
So all the other industries address their issues, will the carbon emissions also decline?
What's interesting about that is aviation has actually done a fantastic job of decarbonizing its emissions intensity on a per seat, per passenger basis. With Airbus and Boeing coming out with new generation aircraft, the Max and the Neo family, for instance, we're seeing a 15 to 20% efficiency improvement from each generation of aircraft. But with that absolute growth, particularly spurred on in emerging markets, looking at China, India, Brazil, you're having, a lot of people flying for the first time as they enter, the middle class. And that's, fantastic. That's what we want to see as an industry. But we also have to recognize that can exacerbate some of the emission challenges. So for us as consultants, it's how can we work with carriers, regulatory agencies, airports to tap into that growth, but doing so in a way that is environmentally mindful and recognizes some of those sustainability challenges. Looking beyond the fuel burn emissions and taking a more holistic look at the sectoral impacts of aviation. So, we analyzed everything from how passengers get to the airport, looking at some of the waste challenges on board, GSE equipment, ground service equipment at airports, looking at opportunities for electrification in those areas. So, the industry as a whole often claims the wider economic benefit that the industry brings to trade, to manufacturing, towards interconnectivity. But also now the industry is having to look at and assess its impacts beyond just scope 1. So looking at those scope 3 emissions. And one of the main areas I've been focused on recently, and I've been working with airlines and airports on, is trying to tackle that waste challenge, looking at eliminating single-use plastics and looking at reducing the amount of catering waste, food and beverage waste that is untouched on board, because the way that the regulatory structure is set up in global aviation is quite outdated, where you have your international catering waste, which has to be incinerated on international travel. The regulation was born out of biohazard safety concerns, but the industry and certain carriers have been able to prove that those concerns are mitigated now with modernized, waste management systems, but the regulation hasn't caught up. So that's a big area a lot of airlines and airports are looking at, is how can we reduce the plastic and the amount of waste on board.
Wow. Have you ever thought to suggest to the airlines, and I'm asking this question seriously, that they should just force every passenger to carry their own trash off the airplane?
Well, that's actually something funny you mentioned that, because that's actually a discussion I've had with an airline. They'll remain unnamed for now, but people are trying anything and everything, and you've seen a lot of airlines now rolling out pilot projects, looking at integrating alternative products on board, reusable items in economy class. So it's kind of, I would say, the Wild West right now, right? If you go on one airline, they may give you a bamboo fork and knife. Another airline will give you sunflower husk, and people are just trying to figure out what works, what aligns with their brand, what are passengers happy using. But that waste challenge is actually quite significant. And while it may not have the same carbon impact, that is a much more relatable point to the average passenger. They may not know about their carbon emissions or anything about the carbon intensity of jet fuel, but they recognize when they're using plastic. Google Flights have their metric. When you go to book, it says what the expected carbon equivalent is in terms of trees, like how much carbon, how many trees it would take to reduce that carbon. But now EASA, the European FAA equivalent, is working on a flight labeling tool to come up with a methodology to very accurately say what the carbon emissions are for a particular route on a particular aircraft. But there's so much variability now. But those are tools and different systems and initiatives that are trying to raise awareness. One of the challenges that aviation is having is around greenwashing. That's one of the biggest challenges now. You've seen KLM recently run into some greenwashing challenges. Delta last year, the lawsuit was brought against them for $1 billion against false net zero claims because of the validity of their carbon offsetting program. So, while I think we definitely need to find a way to recognize great work and improvements in emission reduction, I think throwing around the label of green flights, sustainable flights, I think needs to be done with quite a bit of precaution. And airlines need to be able to substantiate those claims. And there's great carriers out there doing fantastic work when it comes to improving their operations, when it comes to procuring sustainable aviation fuel. And I think those initiatives need to be highlighted and brought to the surface rather than, throwing out the catch-all of green flights.
So carbon offsets are a contemporary topic, and there's a bit of confusion about what it is and why. Can you explain?
Carbon offsetting is one of the tools used by the industry to help mitigate and reduce their emissions. So it is either nature-based or technology-based solution to mitigate the same amount of carbon that is emitted by operations. So
Okay.
nature-based solutions are quite varied, but they can, range from, planting a tree to making investments in removing, coal-fired, cookery and cooking processes in the developing world. So it's a wide spectrum of different initiatives that can be used to, remove or offset the amount of carbon emitted by the industry. Within aviation, there is a global offsetting scheme called CORSIA, which was developed by ICAO, the UN's body on aviation. And right now it's in its voluntary phase. In 2027, it becomes mandatory, and that covers all international aviation emissions between participating countries. And the idea is to cap aviation emissions at 85% of 2019 levels. So what the offsetting scheme does is for every additional, ton of carbon emitted above that baseline, it has to be offset through a verified emission offsetting program to ensure that we don't, as an industry, exceed those levels. In terms of effectiveness, that is where you have some quite divisive opinions as to whether CORSIA is fit for purpose. And I could go on a tangent about that. Sum it up in simple terms is you have all of these global market-based measures around carbon, not just for aviation. You have the European emission trading system, you have a similar system in the UK as well. But for aviation, the cost that is placed on carbon, the cost per ton to offset is much lower than you would find in other carbon markets. So that's just where some of the effectiveness or the conversations around effectiveness come into play. It's are airlines paying for what they actually emit? That is the question that the industry has today.
Well, Max, now what are the market forces that are driving airlines and the entire supply chain around this change by 2027?
Yeah, so last year there was a long-term aspirational goal that was agreed to by all carriers, by the aviation industry, which is net zero by 2050. So that long-term aspirational goal is driving a lot of the voluntary action around sustainable aviation today. And that goal was developed to try align the industry to the 2015 Paris Agreement. When it comes to growth and action on sustainable aviation fuels, you have a differing of approaches between Europe and the US, where the US has been pursuing a support system using different incentives, different policy incentives on the federal and state level, while Europe has been looking to drive action on sustainable fuels and sustainable aviation through mandates, mandating that airlines use sustainable fuels. So you have a differing of approaches globally that is driving the action, and they're having varying levels of success. The US now is a global leader when it comes to sustainable fuel production because of the support system that is in place today. Whereas in Europe, the sustainable mandates come into effect starting in 2025. So we'll see over the coming years how effective that differing approach is to sustainability. Yeah,
interesting.
But I think it raises a really interesting point is as various industries and as various countries work to decarbonize, how are we tracking that? How are we verifying that? And how is it being reported? And I think to come up with these national and global systems that align, different industries and different countries is so important. So not everyone's having different reporting systems and different ways of accounting for decarbonization.
Thank you so much, Max, for the time you spent with us today. Any parting thoughts you'd like to convey to the audience?
Yeah, I think a really important piece is that, decarbonizing the aviation sector, like many other sectors, isn't the sole challenge of aviation stakeholders themselves. When we think about sustainability and wider decarbonization, it really has to be seen as a collaborative effort. So just looking at aviation, airlines can't decarbonize without the hydrogen economy developing. Aviation can't decarbonize without the support of established oil and gas majors who will transition to producing sustainable fuel. Aviation can't reduce its environmental impact without passengers thinking about, what waste am I going to bring onto the airplane? And aviation, just like every other industry, needs the support and framework from regulators. So when we think about sustainability and this decarbonization challenge, it has to be done so in a collaborative way to see how other industries can draw on knowledge and experience, and how we can all essentially work towards that same end goal. Just looking at carbon capture, for instance, that has so many applications for, so many different industries, aviation being one of them. But how, as an industry, can we invest in our peers? How can we invest in our partners to work towards that common end goal? So that's just something that I always think of in my work is, what knowledge, what experience can I draw on, and what knowledge and experience can I share other industries as well? Because at the end of the day, a rising tide raises all boats, or whatever, however that saying goes. But
I think that is the saying.
We're in this together, and while it may seem that different airlines are trying to always one up the other one with different targets, different emission reduction aspirations, I think it breeds, a friendly competition within the industry and across industries as well. Have a good one, and happy Earth Day.
Wow. So one of the things we didn't get the chance to talk, live with Maks about, but he was instrumental in that first net zero flight, Virgin Atlantic, Virgin Airlines from Heathrow all the way to JFK and back. And they use 100% sustainable fuel for that. So
impressive.
Big achievement. He's picked an incredibly challenging field to join. So congratulations to Maks. We also want to mention that, this is actually truly an emerging field beyond just aviation. James Dickey from our management consulting team told us that his eldest daughter is a conservation biologist and has dedicated her professional career to bringing our environment back into sustainable and mutually supporting alignment around native species. That's going to be her focus.
Absolutely. We've got a lot of clients that are doing different initiatives in this space also. So, it's great that individuals like you and others are dedicating their careers to this important topic. There's no doubt about that.
Right. So thank you, Maks. Keep up the good work. And also to James Dickey's eldest daughter.
Yes.